Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh, I'm going to close this curtain. I can't see myself on the glare of the screen. Good morning, guys. Hope you're all doing well today. Yeah, so we're about halfway through the semester. Good to see you guys. Good morning. We're about halfway through the semester. We're in week 7, which is pretty awesome. That we're almost halfway through there. We've got this week. We've got a week next week, and then it's spring break, which is excellent. So we're just trucking along. We're just keeping the same schedule that we've been doing. We've got an analysis paper due at the end of this week, and we'll be discussing this week's documents on Friday. And then you just have a quiz next week. So it's going to be a nice, easy week next week before spring break happens, which is really great. Yeah. Well, right now, today, we're basically just going to go over the revolutionary period of the mid-19th century. We've been talking a lot about ideologies like communism, the new industrial West, and the problems that it causes for people and opportunities. You guys did a really good job in your essays, the essay portion of your exams, talking about the cause and effect and problems and solutions and upsides and downsides of this period. So what we're doing is moving on, and we're going to be talking about the revolutions of 1848 today. These revolutions will feature pretty heavily in the quiz next week, and also in the second exam that we're going to have after spring break. So that's the reason why we're going to be talking about these things today. This will overlap with some of your textbook readings a bit. But I want to emphasize a few different points that you're going to be quizzed and tested on. Does anyone have any questions about anything in the class so far? We pretty much good on everything? Yeah, you guys are overall doing really well. I've tried to make this a nice, manageable, I don't want to say easy class, but one that's manageable for you guys as you balance, school from home, because it's not always easy. But if you have any questions or concerns, you always feel free to email me, let me know, or let me know in these classes. Okay, so I'm going to be going pretty fast through this today. It's just basically just talking about the revolutions of 1848, why they happened, where some of them happened, what are the most important ones, because these are featuring pretty heavily, and like I said, in your quiz next week and your exam after the break. So I want to draw like a pretty clear continuity line here between the French Revolution and a bunch of other revolutions that happened in the West. So basically what happened is in 1848, we see an explosion of revolutions throughout the West. We'll be talking about some of those in just a minute. But a lot of them are predicated on lessons learned from the French Revolution, the big one that we talked about, which is people for a little while in France got greater participation in their government, which they like. They don't necessarily like being told what to do by a king all day, every day. We have a tradition of voting here in the United States, at least in theory. We can vote for leaders that do what we want them to do, right? At least in theory. Unless they're flying down to Cancun or something on a sudden vacation in the middle of a crisis. But, that happens. But for a while, people living under the kings and queens in Europe felt that the French Revolution was a nice break from being told what to do by their monarchs. And they want to return to that. The Enlightenment ideals of individual liberty, right? The greater freedom of speech, freedom of exercising your religion, things like that. Freedom of the press. These are all great things. And traditionally, monarchs, kings and queens do not like freedom in this way because they like having all the power. And then finally, there's this idea that we can do better than the absolute monarchs of the French pre-revolutionary period, right? We can do better than these monarchs who hold all the power in society. Society can, in fact, evolve to become more inclusive and more satisfactory for more people. And for a little while, the French Revolution accomplished those things because, they, even under Napoleon, even during the time where they had a dictator, it was at least better than having an absolutist monarch because they had freedom of the press, they had freedom of religion, they had universal rights and a constitution that they could enjoy. So us in the United States, we're just chilling, really, because we're already working towards that kind of, building a government by the people for the people at this time. At least in theory, obviously there are certain privileged classes in the United States at this time, and unprivileged classes. But in Europe, it's this blanket, like kings and queens have all the power. So the French Revolution failed in the short term, but its ideas didn't go away. Like, I want that to be one of the main takeaways from today. Just because the French Revolution failed, Napoleon rose to power, the kings in France did come back. The ideas of the French Revolution stuck around, and they planted the seeds for a new round of revolutions throughout the West. And some of those things stuck around even more. Okay. So those are the big things for today. There's a few different contextual points I want to hammer home because, again, like I said, these feature pretty heavily in the assessments going forward. All right, so move pretty fast here. There were some revolutions between the end of the French Revolution and the 1848 ones. I'm going to mention a few of those. There was a minor revolution in France, the July Revolution of 1830, where the French people elected a new king. It was this kind of weird halfway between a democratic body and a monarchy. But they kicked out the last of the Bourbon monarchs, King Louis the 18th. He's the last of this kind of long line of Louis, and the French people elect a rather kind of, at least on the surface, a liberal king who's interested in giving people more liberty. He's not actually interested in that, as we'll see in a little bit. But at least there's this July Revolution where the French appoint a new king, which is a pretty big deal. Also in Russia, which is the most conservative state in the West, sees the death of one of the great czars, the great emperors, in 1825. They get they basically get turnover in their empire, and a new emperor named Nicholas I takes over. However, parts of the military don't like Nicholas. They want to appoint his brother. And so there's this short-lived revolution called the Decembrist Revolt, where a branch of the Russian military tries to overthrow the Emperor of Russia. It does not work. The Decembrist Revolt is put down. Most of its ringleaders are executed. But at least it's an attempt at appointing rulers who are promising more freedoms for the average person. So there's these little baby steps towards sort of, you get the sense, like people living in the West get the sense that there's this change going to happen right around the corner, and we're not quite ready for it yet, but there's something in the air that people are just ready to overthrow sucky forms of government. We also get the Greek War of Independence. I don't want to actually spend too much time on that. Don't worry about that. I'm not going to test you on it. Greece becomes an independent country, and it really doesn't impact too much what we're talking about today. All right, so this brings us to 1848. There's this kind of simmering, like I said, this kind of simmering pot that there's this revolutionary fervor that peeks its head out from time to time throughout the West. And it finally explodes in 1848. It happens first in France because France is really, really good at revolutions, I guess. Like they've just had lots of practice by now. And by the time 1848 rolls around, France once again is the spark that lights the whole powder keg. So the liberal king that the people appointed in 1830 in the July Revolution, Louis Philippe, he kind of goes back on a lot of his promises. He says he's going to give greater liberties to the people. He's going to give up some of his power as a king. He doesn't really do that. He also cozies up to special interests, I guess is what we call it in the United States. He spends a lot of his time hanging out with the wealthy landowners and the rich capitalists of France, while the poor people have nothing. This coincides with a period of high unemployment and starvation. In Paris, where there's an economic downturn, which is always like a ripe time for revolution. And there's this horrible quote by the king's advisor when he's confronted with a lot of complaints about the government and how it's locking normal people out of decision making. And one of the king's advisors says, get rich and then you have the right to vote on what goes on in France. This does not go down well. This quote is printed all throughout newspapers throughout France. This is basically like let them eat cake moment. And the king's advisor accidentally gets his boss in a lot of hot water with the people because he's basically saying, we don't really care about the poors. And so in February of 1848 is when things really go down. There's this massive banquet held in Paris called the George Washington Banquet. And the reason why there's this banquet held in George Washington's honor is because freedom of political assembly was not a right in France under the kings. Like, you couldn't get together as a group and talk about how you wanted to form like a political party. That was illegal. So the kind of workaround for this law was, we're going to get together and have a feast. And if we happen to talk politics at this feast, well, that's just an accident. But we're not actually assembling as like a political group because that's against the law. We're just getting together to have a potluck. And so a bunch of middle class liberals throw a banquet in honor of George Washington, who's seen as a revolutionary hero in France. And they get together, they start talking politics. The government is decidedly not stupid, like they know what's going on, and they send in troops to break up this political party. Things go bad, government troops open fire, they kill some of the crowd, and that's when Paris goes into full-scale revolution mode, when government troops open fire on the people, and some people die. So Paris goes into full revolt. The king, who has the spine of a jellyfish, flees the country and goes into exile. And that's it. That's the end of the monarchy in France forever. They still have not yet had a king. Not yet, anyway, although there are political parties in France trying to bring back the monarchy for some reason. I have a buddy in Paris who lives there, and he talks about on the ballot, they can vote for like the monarchy party to try and bring back the king. Pretty nuts. But here's the here is the second kind of French Revolution, right? This is which leads to the Second Republic. They bring back a lot of the greatest hits from the first revolution that they had 50 years before. So reinstituting universal male suffrage, essentially all men get the right to vote. And France is more progressive than the United States is at this time, right? Because the United States still has slavery in 1848. There are millions of disenfranchised Black people in the United States. But in France, they say, no, no, no. Regardless of race, all men get the right to vote. So in some ways, the Second French Revolution is more progressive in striving for equality than the United States is at the time, because we have this huge racial hangup still to this day. It's a big problem because people are idiots. So there's this male suffrage that's instituted, and women still don't get the right to vote. Like, women have been clamoring for the right to vote, for equality. It still doesn't happen, and it's not going to happen until the 20th century. So much for, equality of all human beings. There's also this national workshops idea that the government puts in place because there's a ton of unemployed people running around. The idea is to put them back to work. So the government starts up these factories that are owned by the government, and they employ people who are down and out, right? It's basically like a temp agency run by the government. So it ends up falling apart because it's underfunded and understaffed. It does work for a little while, but after a few months, the government sort of just stops funding this idea and it goes bust. This leads to a lot of criticism about how socialism is bad and it doesn't work. Well, of course, it doesn't work when you don't put the money and time and effort into it. So the national workshops is this kind of idea that we're going to bring full employment to France, but it doesn't work because they don't actually fund it. And then what's interesting is one of the first presidents of this new Second Republic is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, like the dictator, the guy who overthrew the first revolution and set up his own empire. What's interesting is the president of France becomes the nephew of Napoleon. His name is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. And sometimes history repeats itself in really weird ways. France had a republic, and then Napoleon overthrew it, right? And he set up a dictatorship. The same exact thing happens in 1851, 3 years after the French have their new revolution and set up a new democracy. Another Napoleon comes along and overthrows it and becomes a dictator. I don't know what the French have going on over there, but I don't know. They're stuck in Groundhog Day or something because they get a new Napoleon. This one is Napoleon III. He becomes the new emperor of France. But it's not just France. So France is the first to have a revolution in 1848. This map kind of gives you an idea of the flashpoints of all throughout Europe. And the United States, by the way, we don't really talk about them a whole lot in Western Civ, at least until the World Wars, because frankly, the United States doesn't really matter in the scope of things. They're not as big or rich as the European countries until we get to the World Wars. And then the United States actually becomes a world power. But all throughout Europe, there's different revolutionary activity in Spain, in Portugal, in Austria, in Germany, in Russia, like all throughout, really. So I'm going to hit on a few of the main revolutions because it's a mixed bag whether or not 1848 actually is this like liberal turning point towards individual freedom and liberty. It just depends on where you are in the West. So there's the Hungarian Revolution in 1848. It starts with a poet, Sándor Petőfi, reading this epic revolutionary poem in the downtown like square of Budapest. And this inspires a bunch of people to go out, seize the presses, which are controlled by the king. They declare an end to the rule of the kings. And it works for a little bit until the Hungarian elite ask for help in putting down the revolution, and they get help from Russia. Russia is really good at sending troops into neighboring countries. And that's true even in the 21st century. But Russian troops roll in, they put down the revolution, they help reinstitute monarchical control of Hungary. So we get this failed revolution in 1848 in Hungary, but the people were ready for it. And they succeeded up until foreign troops came in and shot a bunch of people and basically put down the rebellion, which is unfortunate for the revolutionaries. So we've got the Hungarian Revolution, which is briefly successful and then fails. So that's just one. And by the way, I'm going to post the file on Blackboard in case you missed something. In Austria, we get another interesting thing where it's students like you guys, kind of late secondary and college students, university students, flood the streets of Vienna. And they set up barricades, they seize pitchforks and whatever guns they can get their hands on, and they rise up against the government in Austria. So yeah, get your pitchforks out, guys, because it's your turn now. Well, honestly, students have always been the kind of vanguard of revolutionary movements throughout the world. It's been that way for a couple hundred years. Because you guys haven't had your souls crushed by living through decades of soul crushing adult life. You're still hopeful, youthful, optimistic people, which is wonderful. So the emperor in Austria sits down at the negotiating table with the rebels. He doesn't send in troops to crush everyone like he does for a little bit, but he's interested in brokering a peace. And the emperor of Austria agrees to end serfdom, which is basically like peasants being indentured servants on the land that they work. Like basically, it's kind of like slavery, but it's not nearly as severe as chattel slavery. But it's still like enforced servitude to be a peasant. That goes away. He agrees to writing a new constitution and setting up a new constitution with certain universal rights, just like the French model. So that's a big win. And then repealing other oppressive laws that are in place in Austria, such as freedom of the press and freedom of assembly. Those things are written into the Constitution. So there's no overthrowing of the emperor in Austria, but some liberal laws guaranteeing liberty, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, those things are guaranteed by this new constitution. Is that a successful revolution? It depends on your goals, right? Some of the people, they got what they wanted. The student revolutionaries who wanted a new government, they didn't get it, but they also got a lot of things they did want, such as, new liberal laws and throwing away of the old ones. So that's Austria. And then in Prussia, which is the largest country in Germany, because Germany is not yet a united country. In Prussia, we get a revolution. The king hears of events happening in Austria, and he decides to play his hand a little bit differently. He preempts a lot of the big revolts in the streets by granting some reforms right out of the gate. He says, okay, I'm going to give you guys freedom of speech. Don't go all revolution on me. I'm just going to give you right now. I'm just going to lay this on the table. Freedom of speech. Okay. Meanwhile, he's assembling his troops to come in and disperse the revolutionary crowds that are assembling in Berlin. And so he kind of does this bait and switch. He's like, all right, I'm going to give you guys one win, but then I'm going to send in the troops and break up everything before it gets out of hand. The king does promise more reforms that'll come later. He later backtracks on this because he's got all the troops and he's got all the power. So in Prussia, it's another mixed bag where like you get a tiny little bit of concession and then the government clamps its boot down on everybody immediately after. What's interesting though is in 1848, we get the Frankfurt Assembly, which is in the city of Frankfurt. It's a German city. A bunch of delegates from all the different German nations got together and decided we're going to try and unite Germany into one country under a liberal democracy. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work this time. But later on, we do get a united Germany, and it's only after World War II that you get a functioning democracy in Germany. But they tried 100 years before that, they tried to actually institute something like that, and it just didn't work. Things weren't ready yet. But the Frankfurt Assembly is this kind of short-lived democratic body of German liberals who try and unite Germany and set up a democracy. They have to go through a couple world wars before they're ready for that, though. There's a few other notable uprisings. You guys don't really need to know these, but there's uprisings in Ireland against British rule. That doesn't work. There's uprisings in Saxony, which is another German country. That doesn't work. In Italy, you get different city. Italy is not a united country yet either. But in various cities, you get revolutionary movements against their governments, their local governments. Some of them work, some of them don't. But by 1850, just a couple years after this explosion in revolutionary sentiment, most revolts, if they haven't succeeded yet, they go away. They burn out, they run out of steam. Russia really is the only country in Europe that gets away with not having a revolution. And so does Great Britain, because Great Britain already has a kind of liberal government. They have a parliament, they have elections and stuff like that, which is what the rest of Europe wants. So Russia and Great Britain escape any kind of revolutionary movements, but everyone else has to go through some spasm of violence against their governments. Right. Okay, so I'm almost done. What are some of the outcomes from 1848? Well, we get some limited gains for liberal movements, people who want to set up new governments, new constitutions with universal rights. That's basically what a liberal is. They basically want individual liberty written into the government law. You get some of that. You get some of that in Austria, in France, even in Prussia before the troops get sent in. But in most places, with the exception of France, most countries cannot get rid of their monarchs. They still have kings and queens running the show. That is not going to change until after World War I. So we're stuck with these kings throughout the West. If you're living anywhere besides France, you're still living under a king with more or less oppression. But at the same time, you can't really put the genie back in the bottle now, right? France was the only country to go through revolution in the late 18th century. Everyone else just kind of stood by and watched. But now, 50 years after the first French Revolution, that revolutionary impulse has spread all throughout Europe, right? With the exception of Russia and Britain. Everybody wants freedom. Everybody wants liberty. Everybody wants universal rights. Everybody wants new constitutions. Everybody wants new governments where they can vote in their leaders. That that sentiment doesn't go away. Just because 1848 wasn't a success for the most part, people at least tried. And they're going to gear up for round two sometime down the road. So The other big takeaway from this is with France and Austria having somewhat successful revolutions, also Great Britain is a democratic country. There's this clear distinction between a liberal Western Europe, where if you're somewhere in the West, you probably have greater freedoms and greater say in your government. The further east you move, to Hungary, to Russia, Poland, those places are more conservative and they have more oppressive governments. That is still true today. When the Cold War breaks out in the 20th century, you have a very liberal, democratic, capitalist West versus a communist, authoritarian East. In 2021, you guys, Britain, France, Spain, Germany, they all have democracies. Hungary is descending into dictatorship right now. Poland is descending into authoritarianism. And then, of course, we have Vladimir Putin in Russia, who's basically an emperor. So it's still this kind of divide between East and West today. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah. About the Cold War doesn't start until after World War II.
Yes. Yes, but we're already laying the foundation between a liberal West and an authoritarian East. So just because communism hasn't come around yet, and just because the Cold War hasn't broken out yet, we can see the patterns already emerging, dividing West and East 100 years before the Cold War. So yeah, that's good. Thanks for pointing that out. So that's something to kind of keep in mind is like, these revolutions kind of lay the groundwork for how successful is your country in guaranteeing rights for people, in providing democratic voting power. The further east you go, the less of it you have. That's basically the pattern that starts to emerge. So, all right, well, that's it, guys. You are well positioned now to be answering some questions going forward. On Friday, we'll be discussing de Tocqueville, who is a French guy who tours the United States, and he talks about how great American democracy is, which is kind of, I don't know, just ironic in some ways. And then we also, we have another document to discuss as well. These two documents, along with the two from last week, will play into your analysis paper. So if you have any questions about those, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to discuss them on Friday. All right, that's it. Any other questions today?
Yeah. Is this going to be on Blackboard, the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'll post it.
Okay.
I'll post it in case I miss something. Yep.
All right.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot. Thanks for being here. Yeah. Have a good Tuesday.